The book of Numbers takes an interesting detour in what we're going to be looking at today. At this point in time, the Israelites have had a few victories before they've crossed the Jordan River, but that's where they've reached. They're actually in their last encampment before they're going to go over. Now, it's going to be a while, all the rest of the book of Numbers, and then also the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy, but they are there. And it's at this point that the story shifts off of them for a while and onto two characters called Balak and Balaam. Balak was the king of Moab, who was afraid that he was next on Israel's hit list. And Balaam was a Mesopotamian sorcerer, who is an odd mixture, we're going to see, of true prophet and profiteering charlatan. And the two of them had a very important lesson to learn that's an enduring one even today, which is that what God says goes. We should trust His hold on the future and speak His words rather than our will. And so we're going to set up things a little bit first here. We're going to be reading from Numbers chapter 22, but before I can start doing that, there's some groundwork to lay that starts in Numbers chapter 21, because it's at that point that we learn that the Israelites, while they were on their way to the Jordan, they were attacked by a group of people called the Amorites. And the Amorites wanted to prevent Israel from getting any closer, but Israel defeated them and took their land. And so it was actually the first steps of the conquest, when that wasn't even what they were trying to do. This wasn't the part of the promised land. It wasn't land that they were supposed to be getting, but it happened because the Amorites picked a fight that they couldn't win. And so as they're continuing to move forward, they get closer to the land of Moab. And the Moabites were terrified since it seemed like they were next in line. Now, God had actually told the Israelites to not bother with the people of Moab at all, but they didn't know that. They weren't willing to take any chances. And so they wanted to fight, but they also doubted their odds in battle, and so that was why their king Balak called in a ringer, Balaam, who wasn't a warrior but a warlock, an expert in divination, who was believed to have power to manipulate the gods. And he was willing to reach out to any god if the price was right. And so that is why Balak called on him, was to come and curse the Israelites, to in fact get the Lord to curse the Israelites for him. Now, initially he refuses, because God actually did speak to him, told him not to go. But then Balak sent an even better offer. And so Balaam tried to convince the Lord again, and this time God gave him permission and just told him, whatever I say, that's what you need to speak. And so that's where we find ourselves in Numbers chapter 22 at verse 22. It says that God's anger was aroused because Balaam went. And the angel of the Lord took a stand in the way as an adversary against him. And he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" And Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you have abused me. I wish there were a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you." So the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you?" And he said, "No." And then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would have also killed you by now and let her live." And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back." And then the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with the men, but only the word that I speak to you, that you shall speak." So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. So going back to the beginning of the story, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, why was God angry that Balaam went? Because that feels a little bit contradictory. He gave him permission to go. In order to answer that, we have to remember the situation and the terms that God had given him. Balaam was celebrated for his ability to convince the gods to do things. And whatever that normally meant, whatever it was that he was doing on a regular basis, in this case, he believed he had convinced Yahweh to let him go after the Lord had said no in the first place. So he also thought he'd be able to do it again. It was natural for him to believe he would prevail in getting the Lord to curse Israel. And so it was that attitude. It wasn't merely the act of going, it was that belief he had that angered God and led into this situation with some very powerful contrasts. You have the stubborn beast here being the man, not the donkey. And the wise spiritist cannot see the spirit that's right in front of him while his simple animal recognizes this danger. An eloquent prophet who just has this guttural rage while the dumb creature is the one speaking rationally. Which, of course, is a pretty unusual miracle, and we can't say exactly what happened here, whether the donkey was enabled to use human speech or whether Balaam was enabled to understand what it was thinking. Either way, it's incredible, which is the point. God has established the course of nature, the way that it normally works, but he does, on occasion, break in on that course in order to show his power over it. And sometimes he does so in very spectacular ways. Other times he does so in ways where something totally unexpected acts in a way that brings him glory. And so that's what you have here, with a donkey that speaks. Or in the example of David, a shepherd boy somehow being made into a king. And then there's also how it was proclaimed that if humanity did not offer the praise that God was due, that the rocks would cry out, because that is what God would cause to be. And of course, above everything else, is how death gave way to life in the ministry of a Judean preacher. How Jesus, how little thought was him of his, at his time, how little people thought of him, and yet what it was that he accomplished. This is the way that God works in the world. He uses the weak and foolish to prove the weakness and foolishness of those who pride themselves on their strength and wisdom. That's what the Apostle Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. So that's what he's done to Balaam. That's why he has the donkey say these things to him, to draw attention to the fact he has no idea what he's doing. And that's a lesson we need to learn too. God can't be manipulated. So we shouldn't try. He should not try. Instead, he should only repeat what he was told. So that is now what he's prepared to do, and it's what he does as we move forward. Going now to verse 41, the last verse of this chapter, and then into 23. It says that so it was the next day that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal, that from there he might observe the extent of the people of Israel. And then Balaam said to Balak, "Build 7 altars for me there, and prepare for me 7 bulls and 7 rams." And Balak did just as Balaam had spoken, and Balak and Balaam offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to Balak, "Stand by your burnt offering, and I will go. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet me, and whatever he shows me I will tell you." So he went to a desolate height, and God met Balaam, and he said to him, "I have prepared the 7 altars, and I have offered on each altar a bull and a ram." And then the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, "Return to Balak, and thus you shall speak." So he returned to him, and there he was, standing by his burnt offering, he and all the princes of Moab. And he took up his oracle and said, "Balak the king of Moab has brought me from Aram, from the mountains of the east. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come denounce Israel. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. There a people dwelling alone, not reckoning itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number 1/4 of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his." Then Balak said to Balaam, "What have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and look, you've blessed them bountifully." So he answered and said, "Must I not take heed to speak what the Lord has put in my mouth?" When Balaam gets to Moab and meets with the king, they make preparations for attempting to curse Israel. And so they go to a shrine of Baal, a place that was holy to the worshipers of this false god, because within paganism, they don't really have a concept of an all-powerful God. Instead, they're all in competition with one another. And so if a place was holy to Baal, then that would mean that he was strong there, which would mean, in contrast, that Yahweh should be weak there. And so he would be less resistant to whatever procedure they're trying to go through. That's the idea behind it. It was also a high place and in a position where they could look out over the camp of Israel to see the whole thing in order to curse the whole thing. Then they do an offering, these 7 bulls and 7 rams on 7 altars. And the idea behind this is not the same as what we saw in Leviticus. So Israel was taught to give sacrifices for atonement, life given for life, in order to pay for sin, in order to pursue forgiveness. That was the idea behind it. For the pagans, that's not how it worked. It was just about actually trying to literally feed the god so that he would be full, and so he would feel good and be more disposed to grant whatever wish was being asked for. It's part of the manipulation that is inherent to the occult. So they do all of these things, and Balak now, the king, is expecting that they're going to be able to pull off this curse. Well, Balaam lowers his expectations. He says, perhaps the Lord will meet with me, because he's hoping that he won't even show up, because he already knows what the Lord will say. But God does have something to say, and gives these words to him, which is really that he's already spoken. He had promised to make Israel a great nation, and he'd done that. He had promised to give them a homeland, and he was about to do that. They were his special treasure, and no one was going to get him to just throw them away. So Balak gets this very unpleasant surprise, which he did deserve for trying to go after Israel in the first place, but it is also Balaam's fault, because he withheld the, you'd think, somewhat critical detail that he'd already been told all of this. Back in 22, the Lord had told him that Israel was blessed. This was never going to work. And if he had just said that to begin with, when Balak was asking him, then Balak probably would have given up. But Balaam wanted his money. That's why he's here. He's still hoping to earn his big payday. So they try again. And so we see this next attempted curse in chapter 23, starting at verse 13. There Balak said to him, please come with me to another place from which you may see them. You shall only see the outer part of them, and shall not see them all. Curse them for me from there. So he brought him to the field of Zophim, to the top of Pisgah, and built 7 altars, and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. And he said to Balak, stand here by your burnt offering while I meet the Lord over there. Then the Lord met Balaam, and put a word in his mouth, and said, go back to Balak, and thus you shall speak. So he came to him, and there he was, standing by his burnt offering, and the princes of Moab were with him. And Balak said to him, what has the Lord spoken? Then he took up his oracle and said, rise up, Balak, and hear. Listen to me, son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? Behold, I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, I cannot reverse it. He has not observed iniquity in Jacob, nor has he seen wickedness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt. He has strength like a wild ox, for there is no sorcery against Jacob, nor any divination against Israel. It must now be said of Jacob and of Israel, oh, what God has done. Look, a people rises like a lioness, and lifts itself up like a lion. It shall not lie down until it devours the prey and drinks the blood of the slain. And then Balak said to Balaam, neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. So Balaam answered and said to Balak, did I not tell you, saying all that the Lord speaks, that I must do? So this time, they go to where only the outskirts of Israel can be seen. The idea being that if the Lord could only see part of them, he'd maybe think there weren't so many. And so he wouldn't care as much, and he'd be more inclined to curse them. It's utterly foolish, but that is what they are reduced to at this point, and obviously went about as well as really should have been expected, because God's no liar. He's not fickle and double-minded the way that human beings are. What he wills to do, he does. And no one, nowhere, no when, can force him to change his mind. By trying, the Moabites, unfortunately, were just inviting their own destruction. Now, along with what essentially amounts as a threat and a warning to them, we do also get this comment that should surprise us when we see it, where it says that Israel is righteous. To hear that God has observed no iniquity in Israel is not something that you would think after everything that we've seen in the book of Numbers. A little bit out there. But there is a reason for it. Actually, two reasons. First, it partly connects to the idea of this sorcery that they're trying to do. And so that's why it appears in this context, because it's the idea of the evil eye. That you could get through a curse, through some type of magic, you could make a god or a demon or a spirit look with an evil eye on somebody and then drag their life down from there. So that's what Balaam was trying to do. And so God is saying that Israel can't be cursed by magic that's going to make him look disfavorably at them. So that's part of it. But it also does have a more direct meaning, tying into the fact that, yes, God certainly knew that Israel sinned, but he dealt with their sins in-house. It was between him and them, nobody else. And as far as the rest of the world was concerned, there's no comparison. Israel's definitely righteous in comparison to them. And so that's what he's making clear here, and saying, no, there's no curse that's going to be forthcoming. Now, Balak's frustrated reaction to this is comical and understandable. If you don't have anything bad to say, don't say anything at all, is what he's asking for at this point, but it's too late for that. By insisting that he come, Balak must now hear what Balaam is given to say. And for whatever reason, they try again, one last time, to get Balaam to curse Israel. And it goes no better than before, and that blessing closes by saying that those on Israel's side are also blessed, while anyone who stands against them is cursed. And so that's a repetition, actually, of what Abraham was promised back in the book of Genesis. So it's a warning, but it's also an opportunity for the Moabites if they were willing to take it, but they're not. And in fury at that point, Balak drives Balaam out unpaid. So he gets nothing, except that he is given one last thing to say, which is what we find in Numbers chapter 24, starting at verse 15. It says that he took up his oracle and said, "The utterance of Balaam the son of Beor, and the utterance of the man whose eyes are opened, the utterance of him who hears the words of God and has knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also, his enemies, shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. Out of Jacob one shall have dominion, and destroy the remains of the city." Everything up to this point has dealt with the immediate circumstances. Israel is right there. Balak wants to see them cursed right in that moment. This oracle, as opposed to the others that go before it, is now looking into the far future, as Balaam saw a vision of a king who would come from Israel to defeat all God's enemies. That's the nature of this promise. And when that king was born 1,400 years later, wise men from the east, from the direction that Balaam had come from, they recognized the moment because they saw the rising of his star. And so they journeyed to the land of Israel in order to meet the young Jesus. That is what this promise is about he would come, and then about how his victory would be won, as it has been. We are still waiting for the complete culmination of everything, but we know that there will be the defeat of all that which stands against God, on the basis of what the Apostle Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 to 26. He says that now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so afterward those who are Christ's shall be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, afterward those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and all authority and power. For he must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. And so this is why Revelation chapter 22 calls Jesus the bright and morning star, is because with his resurrection, a new day dawned in which even death was defeated. That is what he has accomplished, and that was what Balaam was given to point forward to all those years before. And it would be nice if the story ended there and Balaam just went home. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And what happens next, back in Israel, is tied into this. In Numbers chapter 25 and in verse 1. It says that Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor." And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Phinehas the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel." Now the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simeonites. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi the daughter of Zur. He was head of the people of a father's house in Midian. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Harass the Midianites and attack them, for they harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of a leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed in the day of the plague because of Peor." This is Israel's last rebellion, is the silver lining, I guess. Or at least it's their last rebellion during the Exodus period, before they get into the Promised Land, because they're going to have those actually in the Promised Land too. But in any case, what we have here is sexual infidelity leading the way to spiritual infidelity. That they were engaged in these cultic practices with these women, and then that was also drawing them into the worship of Baal. And this results in judgment from God. The worst loss of life in any single event during their travels in the wilderness. But tellingly, the congregation was much more split. Many remained on God's side and were dismayed to see what was happening. And he, for his part, calls for the destruction of those who took part. So even though there's a plague that's occurring in Israel, he's making a way for those who are truly responsible to pay the price, because he's not threatening direct retribution and just the outright destruction of the entire nation, as he's done before. And so these things point to it being most likely that this is the last gasp of the cursed elder generation of Israel. Those who had rebelled and had been promised that they would never enter. Well, they're right on the border, and so this is what they do to basically get rid of themselves. And then the crescendo of the story is when Zimri, this person from the tribe of Simeon, who ought to have been a leader, flaunts his sin, bringing this woman right in front of everybody to show her off while they're crying in front of the tabernacle. But Phinehas, who is the grandson of Aaron, and so there's an irony here because Aaron was the ultimate follower, but Phinehas takes the lead by going and striking Zimri down. And by doing that, he becomes the exemplar, really, of everyone that's left. That those who remain had a zeal for the Lord's will rather than insisting on their own. And that's what it takes for blessing to actually be experienced, is to have that desire for the things of God. But what about Balaam? I said that this had to do with him. How? Well, that's because according to Numbers chapter 31, this was his idea. He had counseled the Moabites and their Midianite allies to use women in order to try to lead the Israelites into idolatry. That was how he was hoping to make an end around. And to get around the fact that God would not curse them directly, he'd get them to curse themselves. So that's what he attempts here. Ultimately, he was still unsuccessful even with this, because what was left of Israel were those who were going to be blessed. But this time, rather than just missing out on his pay, he paid the price. Because also according to Numbers 31, God ordered Israel to go on a campaign of vengeance for this, just like it's actually mentioned at the end of what we read here in chapter 25. And during that war, Balaam was also killed in battle. He never made it home. He didn't get away from what he'd done. And so because of this, Balaam has become a byword for evil, in spite of having been one who did speak the true words of God. That's how he's remembered throughout history, in the New Testament itself, actually. In 2 Peter, the apostle there is speaking of false teachers, and in chapter 2, verse 15, he says that they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. And so he's remembered for his greed. And then you have Jesus himself also in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, and speaking to the church at Pergamos, saying, I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. And so Balak is remembered as being one who tempts people out of the worship of God and into the pursuit of evil and idolatry. That's what he's known for, after everything that he could have been. And so he's a warning to us to know that it's about more than knowing. Doctrine's important, but it doesn't do anything for us on its own. He had the truth straight from God. It didn't help him. And it won't help us either unless we actually believe it. If we pride ourselves on what we know and what we do, we will fall like him. We can only stand on what the Lord has promised and accomplished in Christ. And we need to see that truth, to know that it's dangerous to be wise in our own eyes and blind to the truth like Balaam on his donkey, not knowing what is right in front of him and where the danger lies. Instead, we ought to embrace our simplicity, just the things that we don't know, and just appreciate the beauty of God using the weak to overcome the strong. And of course, there's no greater example of that than Christ, who made himself weaker than all. And when it comes to having a zeal for God, that's important as well. And Phinehas clearly had that, and he expressed it by piercing through the wicked. And in doing that, he atoned for the nation and for their sin. But then, of course, there was Jesus, who went even further than that, who showed his zeal for righteousness by being pierced through for the wicked, and how he was stabbed through the side in the final moment on the cross in order to show that he was already dead, had already made that sacrifice in order to provide everlasting atonement to those who believe. And then it was after that that he rose to life again. And in that rising, in that dawning of that new day, became that star that brings life to all who look to him. Now, our enemy still tries to convince God to curse us. But because the Father sees us through the blood of the Son, there is no iniquity to behold. The gospel says that we're blessed forever, and God is not a man that he should lie. And so for anybody who maybe you are still thinking and still living as though you can do things in order to make God accept you just the way you are, as so many people falsely preach, you need to recognize the danger of being like Balak, the king of Moab, picking a fight against God that you cannot win. The danger of being like Balaam, seeking your own way and then trying to insist that God take it. He's not going to. And don't be like Zimri, the Israelite at the end of the story, who placed selfish, short-term pleasure ahead of his own life. Instead, listen to the Lord, who says that blessing is available to you. But you have to look to the light of Christ in order to be saved. And if anyone listening here or online has never made that choice, I hope that you can make it today. And if you do, that you'll let us know so that we can be here for you now. But as for Christians, the path that we are on, we know that we do take faltering steps down it. And there are times of stumbling. But each of those steps is taking us closer to the end of our journey. So let's make the effort to go in the right direction by hearing God and taking Him at His word and then speaking His truth. So that it's not just us, so that everyone can know that He stands against those who defy Him, but He opens the way to those who have their eyes open.